What's happening, Boot Junkies? Mike Dog Audio here, back with another video on home studio setup for VoiceOver. Oh yeah, can we hear it? Yeah, we can hear it. All right, today we're going to talk about a piece of equipment that many of you might find to be just the ticket for what you need for your voiceover needs. And I say that specifically for people who might be gamers, streamers, people who are sending out real-time audio, and maybe don't have the computing horsepower in order to do effects in real time. This is not a very good opening, is it? I'm not happy with how this is coming out, so we're going to do this one again. Let's book into it. All right. What's happening, Boot Junkies? Mike Dog Audio here, back with another video on home studio setup for VoiceOver. And today we're going to talk about a piece of external hardware. Besides your interface and your microphone, this is a preamp and processor, a hardware device that you can add into your signal chain that will actually cover a good portion of the vocal chain that you as a voice actor or as a voice person might need. And the thing we're going to talk about is a DBX 286S. Now what this is this is a combination of a preamp and a series of effects that normally, I typically, when I am recording, I have as VSTs. They're plugins to my signal chain that after I've recorded, they get applied for when I do my final save to disk. So let's quickly just run through the different features, the different sections, and then we'll go through them one by one. The first is the mic preamp, and that preamplifies the signal. It prepares it so that it can be processed by, it boosts the signal so that it can be processed by whatever the next step in your chain is. The next section is the compressor, and we'll talk about what a compressor is. But a compressor is, it reduces the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts. The next section is a de-esser. Then after that, there's a section called an enhancer. Finally, there's an expander / gate, and then there's one more button out here that's called output. Now let's talk about what each one of these are, and we'll start right here with the preamp. The preamp, as I mentioned, it boosts the signal, makes it loud enough so that the processor can do stuff to it, right? The signal as it comes out of the microphone is very, very minute. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of signal. And so that needs to be raised loud enough so that the processor can do stuff with it. As you can see here, it's got these indicators, these LED indicators that show how much signal is being applied. The knob is how much gain, how loud you want this microphone to be. So as you turn it up, the signal gets louder, and we can potentially get up into a warning area where it's up in that yellow. That means you're approaching maximal signal. And if it were to turn red, you would end up clipping the signal where the circuit itself is overloaded and you actually start to distort your signal. What I would do with the preamp is I would start to dial that preamp back until at my normal loudest voice, I'm not quite turning that zero indicator. I don't want it to be too loud. If this microphone required phantom power, this particular one does not. If it required phantom power, I would turn that on here and you'd get a yellow indicator light. And then if I wanted to, I could roll off some of the bass that's being detected from the microphone in this 80 hertz high pass. That's really good for if you have outside rumble of traffic going by, rumble of a furnace. If you just have an underlying rumble in your microphone, some microphones have an underlying rumble, you can take that away. It can also help reduce the effect of plosives on the microphone, taking that 80 hertz high pass. So every high pass means everything above 80 hertz will get passed to the preamplifier or down the chain. Everything below 80 gets blocked. Once you have your preamp set, that's sort of a set it and forget it. You'll keep it like that for the whole session. The rest of the section, the rest of the device is the effects, the different processes that you can affect the signal with. You can bypass all of it and just have all of this part turned off if you want to by clicking the process bypass button, or we're going to leave it undone because we're going to start to go through these. The next section is the compressor. And if you don't know what a compressor is, a compressor just turns down the loudest part. If your signal starts to get too loud, the compressor will turn it down. And what it's doing is it's reducing the difference between the loudest part and the quietest part. So, and that's called the dynamic range. So the very loudest part and the very quietest part. The difference between those is your dynamic range. And a compressor will take that loudest part and start to turn it down. Now, what that does is that reduces the overall volume of the signal, right? Because it's turned down the quietest part. So then what it will do is it will make that up and turn the whole signal back up, the loudest part and the quietest part back up. So the net effect of a compressor will make it seem louder, even though what you've really done is you've just reduced the difference between the loudest and the quietest parts. And it's expressed here as two different buttons. The first is the drive and then the density. The drive is how much compression you want. It might be called a threshold and ratio in other compressors, but you turn that up and it's going to make, even though you'll see the lights will start to say it's reducing the gain, you'll start to see that it's reducing how much it's making it quieter, but really it's making the loudest part quieter and then turning the whole thing up. So the net effect is it actually seems much louder than it did before, and you can control that with the drive. Then the next button, the density, is what the release is. So once it starts to turn that volume down, it will keep that volume down until you start to get below your threshold again, and then it's going to turn that back up. And so that's called here it's called the drive, but you might also see it called release in other compressors. And so getting these two set just right will allow you to have a nice even sound that will allow you to speak quietly. It will allow you to speak loudly, but really the net effect in the listener's headphones is they don't need to jockey that volume dial up and down. A compressor can also be really good if you're one of those. I see this all the time in gaming videos where they'll just be talking, and then there'll be like a jump scare in the video, and they scream. And if you don't know about a compressor, it'll make your listener want to tear their headphones off. It's a terrible experience. But a compressor can turn that down for you automatically, so it still sounds like a scream, but you're not ruining the experience for the listener. So the next section is a de-esser. And all a de-esser is it's a compressor, a very special kind of compressor that just listens for a certain frequency and just turns that frequency down. So in this case, it is for the S sound is what you would commonly use it. So that on a lot of microphones that are very bright microphones, that S sound can turn into a needle in the listener's ear after a while. And so what you would do is you would first find the frequency where your sound is. Mine is typically between 4,000 hertz and 8,000 hertz. Mine is, I think, about 5,400 hertz is just where mine typically is. And then you can say, how loud does that sound need to be before you start to turn it down with the threshold? So there's the frequency and there's the threshold. So that sound. There's just two indicators here, the 1 and the 6. So you can adjust how much that reduction you want that sound to have. So you can see that as you adjust it, you can reduce that sound. So it's really good if you have a bright mic that's got a lot of high end clarity. That S sound can get pretty painful after a while. And so the de-esser will help take that away. It's just a compressor that turns down that one frequency, whatever that frequency might be for you. The next one is the next section of the DBX 286S is the enhancer. And the enhancer is a lot like the bass and treble controls like on your old stereo. It allows you to have greater clarity, greater definition in both the low frequency and the high frequency. There's two different different sections. The first one is the low frequency. And what the low frequency does is it boosts the bass. So as I turn up the density, you'll hear that my voice will get bassier. But generally, if you just naively just turn up the bass, it can also sound muddy. So at the same time, it's turning up that very lowest bass down at 80 hertz or so, 100 hertz in that region. It's also turning down the bass at about 250-ish hertz, that mid-bass region that can tend to sound muddy. So by turning that low frequency definition up, detail, I think is what it says, the low frequency detail. As you turn that up, you'll see my voice will get bassier, have more authority to it, but it won't get muddy, which is pretty neat. You can overdo it though. Don't overdo it, because then you'll just sound, holy cow, you'll sound terrible. You can overdo it. So, subtle. Please, subtle. And then on the other side is the high frequency detail. So this is the treble side. Let's turn that down just a little bit. The treble side is the high frequency detail. So as you turn that one up, you'll see this is like turning up the treble. And so it's doing a similar sort of process. Let's overkill it here. So as I turn it all the way up, you'll see that mic will sound sharp and really crisp and detailed, but it can be over the top. And so what that's doing is that's like increasing the treble. It's adding some clarity to it. So let's turn the high frequency down. I find for my voice that I don't need to turn up a ton of high frequency detail. I don't think it sounds very flattering for me. So I can keep it fairly modest. But it's really, it's up to how it sounds to you and to your voice. The next section is the expander. So if you remember back when we talked about the compressor turns down the loudest parts, The expander turns down the quietest parts, sort of the opposite. So what the expander does is it increases the dynamic range. And really what you would use this for is to help with background noise reduction, background hiss. So what you can do with that, let me see if I can, I'm going to multitask while we're doing this here. So the first thing that you would do is, the first scenario that people will often consider a gate is to help manage background noise. So if you have background hiss from a computer fan or street noise or something like that, I'm going to simulate that with a video of white noise on my phone. So we just have white noise from the phone. So you've got a fan. Now this is going to be sort of over the top so that you can hear it. But so you've got a computer fan that's blowing noise, and you want to try and reduce that noise. I'm going to see if I'm hearing it here and in here. So I'm going to try and mess with this. But what the expander does is it takes that noise floor, that lowest, the quietest it can be, and you first set the threshold of what that is, and then you say how much you want it to turn down. So, and it's expressed as a ratio, and the greater that ratio, 1.5 to 1, 2 to 1, 5 to 1, it will just make it quieter as you turn it up. So I can hear it here at 1.5, but as I start to go up, I don't hear it in my headphones as much. And so you can decide what that noise floor is by adjusting the threshold. So there I can hear it. And as I turn the threshold up, at one point it disappears. And then you can tweak these two, and it starts to reduce it. Now, what you'll notice is when I'm talking, you can still hear that hiss, right? So when the gate is open, everything comes through. And when the gate closes, or the expander closes, it reduces just the quietest parts. So that's what that's done. I'm going to stop this. How do I do that? Why is it not doing? Stop. Thank you. But if you don't have a high amount of background noise, you still may want to use an expander. And what I typically use mine for is I use it to help manage breath, rustling, or things like that when I'm in the booth. So even though my booth itself, it's really quiet in there, really quiet, I don't really have to worry about noise. I do have to worry about just me existing in that booth. And I also have to manage my breath. So if I want to make those breaths quieter, I could go through and try and cut them all out and reduce the volume, or I can have an expander. Just listen to my breath. And just make them quieter so that when I inhale, it just automatically turns it down a little bit. So even if I'm taking those slash breaths, it can still make it a bit quieter. So an expander is a good way to just manage that that low sound and make it a little bit quieter so it's not quite so distracting in your recordings. So good for noise, good for rustling, good for de-breathing. And that's the whole signal chain. That really runs it through. The last button or the last knob here is the output, and that is how loud is the final signal that gets sent back to your interface. And generally, you're going to want to keep that at 0 unless you find it's either way too quiet or way too hot. But that just is if you keep it at 0, that's called unity gain. You can just leave it there. But if you do need to boost that signal up a little bit more, you can add some final output at the end, or you can reduce it if there's too much. But generally, just keep it at 0 and you should be fine. Now, the last thing that you need to consider if you're considering this piece of hardware is how you connect it to your preamp itself or to your interface itself. So can I get this here? I use an interface called an Audient ID22. And it's a, prosumer. It's a nice one. It's a nice one. But the nice feature about this is it allows me to bypass the preamp. So you'll see that this preamp is not active right now. And the DBX has one cable that comes out the back and goes into, let me get this here, it goes into the back there. Excuse me for 1 second, I'm going to make it come around. So you can see right there, it sends it to what they call a return. Not every interface allows you to do a bypass like that. It's you have to look in your manual to see if you can. It will have things like send and return, or it might be labeled direct input, where you can just bypass the preamp. So that's the DBX 286S. I have found that it's this is a loner to me. This is my first experience with it, but I've sort of fallen in love with this, and I'm probably going to keep an eye out to get one for myself because I really like it. And I like having that hardware where I can just set everything and have it be right there for me. I really like the way it sounds. When would you choose this? You would choose this if you needed to have those processes done in real time. You would use this if you had just a very basic interface and you wanted to have a better preamp, you wanted to have a better signal chain. If you needed to stream these effects in real time, you could use this. You'll often see the 286S recommended at the same time when people say, I have a Shure SM7B and it's so quiet, I have to turn my preamp all the way up and it's hissing. People will either say, get a cloud lifter, and a cloud lifter is just a little box that sits in line between your microphone and your interface that adds gain. And that's like $150, and it does one thing, adds a fixed amount of gain, like adds 25 dB gain, and that's all it does. Super clean, super quiet, no effort. It just adds gain. The DBX is only $40 more, $50 more, and it gives you an entire vocal processing chain, including the preamp, the compressor, the everything you need. So for $50 more, it is worth considering the DBX, but you got to make sure that everything can be handled. The Cloud Lifter will work with all interfaces because it's just in line. You don't have to use a send and return. It goes actually in line from your mic itself. Now, the Cloud Lifter will block phantom power, so you really want to use a Cloud Lifter with a dynamic mic. A Cloud Lifter isn't needed for a condenser mic or a mic that takes phantom power. The Cloud Lifter is really for these dynamic mics that require a lot of power. You can do it, but then you can do it with a condenser mic, but then you got to buy a phantom power supply to put on the other side. You don't want to go there if you don't have to. Different video altogether. The DBX 286S. I tell you what, for $199, it's hard to go wrong. It's hard to go wrong with this. I've really been impressed with it. A subscriber loaned this to me to let me evaluate it, and I have just been really just wowed by it. I think it's fantastic. When I turn the preamp all the way up, there's no sound in the headphones. The compression and expansion, the settings are very sound. I've been real pleased with it. It's a shame I have to give it back, but I have to give it back. So I'll keep an eye out for one because that might become part of my chain. We'll see. So that's all I have for you today. The DBX 286S. Give it some thought. Now, go grab your microphone, maybe some external processors, and record something amazing. Talk to you next time. Thanks.